last time, but finally we did. Probably again in the right place. Or it's better if I stay on the right, on the left. Left. There. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Sorry. Is it okay like that?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm trying to do with this talk is to contribute to the development of the science of the future of the EU. So there is now a new scientific field, the future of the EU, and there is a debate on that. There are specialists, professionals, and so I will try to give some idea for this discussion. And of course, I will move from a descriptive, analytical ground to also a normative ground, because when you enter in the discussion about the future of the EU, you have, of course, to think also about vision, method, concept, and so forth. And the main argument that I will try to put forward today is that in order to discuss properly on the future of the EU, we have to skip the sui generis ad hoc interpretation of the European Union and to take the European Union back to the field of comparative federalism literature. So is impossible to discuss about the future of the EU in a constructive way without a solid theoretical background. And that solid theoretical background can be taken only in comparative federalism literature. So this is my roadmap. Let me start from the introduction. When we discuss about the future governance of the EU and in general the literature on governance in the EU, I think that we have to start to look at this literature in a more critical way. In the concept of governance, at least as far as I understand the concept of governance, reading and proposing to my students to read a huge literature, there is too much process and too little institution. And there is an interpretation of politics in the European Union through the concept of governance that is very processual. There is a under-evaluation of the institution and the capacity of the institution to guarantee what in general government guarantee, namely democratic legitimacy. So the concept of governance brought European political leader, civil servant and so forth to underestimate the implication for democratic legitimacy. So I use an approach that recognizes and acknowledges the role of governance, but I try to insert in the concept of governance elements of institutional rules, what we call in comparative politics government. So in order to discuss about the European Union, we have to open up, let's say, an analysis of the combination between governance and government. The decision-making in the European Union is certainly an horizontal, frequently an horizontal process. However, that process takes place within regularized, institutionalized patterns of behavior. And if we don't understand this, we don't acknowledge these patterns of behavior, I think we still remain in this ad hoc sui generis view of the European Union. Of course, I consider, but you find in the background paper that I sent yesterday, that the sui generis view of the European Union is one of the causes of our intellectual confusion. And so it is that idea that Europe is an exceptional experiment without no reference, without precedent, that I try to call into question. Then, on the basis of this theoretical background, the governance should be considered in combination with government in order to bring democratic legitimacy back in the structure of decision-making. I look at the empirical reality of the European Union since Maastricht, and I try to give an explanation why the European Union since Maastricht has become a highly differentiated organization. And then I look at the post-2008 crisis that call into question that kind of differentiation, and then how to come out from this crisis. And I discuss in the paper in particular the last contribution coming from the Commission, the white paper on the future of Europe. You see the science of the future of Europe, made public by Jean-Claude Juncker, April 2017. And then my proposal for coming out from this, I consider a very uncertain, unpredictable situation, and of course we need to make a jump in normative 10. Don't ask me how to arrive to that. This is not my job. This is the job of politics. What I try to do is to raise the good question, as Karl Popper used to say. I leave to politics then the duty to find the right answer. Okay, let's start from the analytical question. When we discuss about governance in the European Union, the future of governance, what is the situation? And the situation can be synthesized, in my view, through this concept that we have in the European Union a differentiated governance regime. What happened in 1991-1992 is a very important critical juncture in terms of governance structure. From Rome, 1957, to Maastricht, the European Union moved in the direction of creating a single market, a common then single market. After the dramatic failure, we need not to forget that after the dramatic failure of August 1954, when the other leg of the European project, the European Defence Community, was voted down by the French National Assembly. That was a dramatic moment, like Brexit in some way, and it was necessary to find a solution. The solution was to stick with the first leg, the European Steel and Coal Community of the year before the European Defence Community. But the two are together. One is Jean Monnet, the other one is Altiero Spinelli, but the two are the two idea of setting up a federal system, like the Schuman Declaration explicitly say. So what you have is since Rome to Maastricht, you have the building up around the single market, common and then single market, a quite supranational organization, organized around a triangular interinstitutional relation, the Commission, the Council, and then more and more the European Parliament. Here we have a governance regime which is a regime that is sensitive to a certain extent to the question of not only effectiveness but also democratic legitimacy, but it is a governance regime that deals with issue of low domestic political salience. So there were no clear conflicts around the building of a common and then single market. Basically, the cost of that process were shouldered by private firms, not by national governments. But in Maastricht, there was a fundamental transformation. The new issue, what we call strategic issue, defense, foreign policy, law and order, migration, entered the European agenda. But in particular, the economic policy of the Eurozone entered the European agenda. But when they entered the European agenda, in particular the economic policy of the Eurozone, were not regulated through the supranational decision-making regime, supranational governance regime that was already in place for dealing with single market issue. I work on the debate that we had in this Intergovernmental Conference in 1991, and it's interesting to me that Helmut Kohl and the people around him were in favor to bring the economic policy of the Eurozone within the framework of the single market. It was basically the French political elite around Mitterrand that didn't want that. The reason why they didn't want to keep the economic policy of the Eurozone within the framework of the single market is open to question. We interviewed some of the people working with Mitterrand, and one of them said, I don't know if that is the truth, but he said, we didn't want to give to the European Parliament too much power in this policy, because in the European Parliament, after all, we lost the symmetry with Germany. Germany now is a unified country after October 1990, is 82 million inhabitants. We are still 65 million inhabitants. So the delegation coming from Germany would be much higher, much more significant than the delegation coming from France. So we pushed for another kind of governance regime. And that kind of governance regime did not have a political theory, because politics many times come out from compromises. But that kind of governance regime, now we know, is a fully intergovernmental governance regime. Decisions are taken by the Council of Ministers and more by the European Council. Decisions have a political character, not a legal character. Decisions are basically negotiated, and they are taken through unanimity within those intergovernmental institutions. In this regime, the Commission plays a very technical role. It's the secretariat of the national governments. The Parliament is a redundant institution, and the European Court of Justice is there for solving only those very delicate disputes. So what we have from Maastricht onward is the formation of two governance regimes. And I found silly, from a theoretical point of view, the discussion that we have between supranationalists and intergovernmentalists. The supranationalists say, "Wow, but the Commission is important." Yes, the Commission is important in the regulatory policy of the single market. And the others say, "No, but matter the national government." National government matter in the strategic policy. What you have is not one European Union, but two European Union at least. Two governance regimes. And those governance regimes were created out of necessity, without a theory. Just you talk about incomplete contract, I talk about interstate compromise, but those two regimes emerged from contingency. And the hope, we interviewed some of the prime minister discussing the Maastricht Treaty. One of them, the Italian one, said, "Our hope was that before or after that kind of intergovernmental constitution would have transferred to the supranational constitution." But it didn't happen, because institutions matter. When you create an institutional setting and you create a logic interest in that institutional setting, it's very difficult to go back. But in particular, it's difficult to go back because those policies, defense, foreign policy, migration, the Eurozone economic policy, those policies have a high political salience for domestic government. They don't allow the Commission, the European Parliament, to decide policy that would affect the electoral fortune of this national government. Angela Merkel cannot leave to Juncker to decide migration policy if migration policy decide the electoral fortune of Angela Merkel. So this is a basic distinction which has to do with the nature of the policy. So different policy generate or imply different institutional regime, different governance regime. And so here is the difficulty of, in my view, in institutional terms, the difficulty of the European Union arriving to the crisis of 2008. Okay, so, at that point, how to manage the crisis, and that is, we try to manage the crisis according to a logic of path dependency. In the intergovernmental constitution, we have an increase of the intergovernmental logic. The ESM, the fiscal compact are just a logical product of a situation in which government control the decision-making process. Where there, in the single market regulatory policy, you have a strengthening of the European Parliament and the strengthening of the Commission. It was the Commission imposing Apple to pay the fine, better, to give money to the Irish government for enjoying very special condition of competition. And even if the Irish government didn't want that money back, but there is the Commission that decide, where in the Eurozone economic policy, when there was the crisis in Greece, and they met in Brussels to how to get out of the referendum in Greece, or the implication of that referendum. In that room, there was not the Spitzenkandidat and Juncker, but in that room there were Hollande, Merkel, Tusk, and the Prime Minister Tsipras of the Greek government. By the way, he got a nervous breakdown, and they were obliged to call his new Minister of Economy. So there, the Parliament and the Commission have no role at all. Where there, in the regulatory policy of the market, even the Irish government could not impede the Commission to start the process. So, how to come out from this very messy situation? It's not a judgmental view that I propose. The institution, after 1954, it was inevitable to create the institution from, let's say, bottom up, through compromise, incomplete contract, try to move on. What I don't think that we can allow ourselves to accept is the ideology of this empirical necessity, that ideology that Jean Monnet made so public, saying, let's wait for the crisis, use the crisis for going on, and then increase supranationalization. It's no longer like that. We have crises, with that crisis bring integration, but as I show with Uwe Poeter in a special issue for Journal of European Integration, you had integration without supranationalization. And that is something that, if you remain within the ideological framework, is impossible to understand. You have integration, but you don't have an increase of power of the EP and the Commission. But you have an increase of power of the European Council and the Council, in particular within the Eurozone. Okay, further step. How to come out from this crisis? So there are many proposals. There was a developmental industry of proposal. The 4 presidents, the 5 presidents, all the think tanks in Europe made the proposal. And finally, we have the white paper. The white paper, I try to rush in order to let the time. The white paper is an interesting document, but it's an interesting document for the lack of solid theory rather than for the proposal that he makes. So here are proposed 5 scenarios, you know very well. I try to study the 5 scenarios. At the very end, there are only 3 plausible scenarios there that we have to consider. The first scenario is scenario number 1. We have to do as much as possible out of this situation. Okay? Is differentiation to the point of creating a sort of Europe a la carte. Then the other plausible scenario is the 5th one. The 5th one, in which the Commission say we have to move in direction in which member states cooperate on all the domains. Okay? So here we have 2 clear scenarios. One is Europe a la carte, and the other one is Europe as a state information. And there is in the middle this idea of a multi-speed Europe. So what I did is, you find in the paper, I tried to look at the intellectual sources of those scenarios, and to look to those intellectual sources through the combination of governance and government. How do they resolve the question of democratic legitimacy? The Europe a la carte is the theory of James Buchanan, a very famous, prominent economist, as it was interpreted by Gian Domenico Maione. Is the theory of clubs of clubs. Europe is a club of clubs. Buchanan and Maione explain that if you are in a very complex organization with a very different view, interest, appetite, it is important to differentiate to the point of creating several clusters of member states dealing with several policy competencies. So here is basically the going back to the European Union as an international organization. So we recognize that we went too far, as Gian Domenico Maione wrote in his book, and we need to go back to the international organization status. But of course, international organizations do not have the problem of democratic legitimacy. They justify themselves in terms of effectiveness of the policy they have to deal with, but they don't have the problem of how to legitimize those decisions or those who took those decisions. The second, the fifth scenario, the alternative, is the state governance scenario. And here, it seems to me, the clear intellectual source is Danny Roderick. You cannot have together integration, international integration or European integration, domestic democracy and sovereignty and national sovereignty. If you want to increase integration, you have to give up to the other two, which is a statist view, which is the view that the only political animal that we can think about for allocating authoritatively values, at least in Europe, is the state. The state is the beginning and the end of our political thought. Within this scenario, you have two state governance hypotheses. State governance A and state governance B. The state governance A is we move in the direction of a state, but that state should be led by national government, what I call the intergovernmental union. And the core institution of this project of Roderick A is the role of European Council. The European Council is the most important institution because there you have deliberation, you have discussion, you have trade-off, you have the possibility to accommodate a plurality of interests. Now, in other paper and books, but especially in this paper that I sent to you yesterday, I show that this is a wrong idea. You can have European Council as a deliberative institutional arena in good time, but in bad time, the European Council is an arena for exercising power. You have to go back to Max Weber in order to understand power relation between states. So here, the democratic legitimacy is obfuscated, and now you explain what kind of democratic legitimacy is obfuscated by the fact that that institution can incentive not consensus but rather domination by the stronger government towards the weaker government. And that empirically happens. So this is a question that we can detect empirically. Moreover, the idea that you can allow the European Council to take decision as a collegial body, at the same time consider those decisions legitimated because the members of the European Council are accountable as individuals to their own parliaments, is a theoretical short circuit. The European Council is not the sum of the individual coordinating within it. It is an institution with its own institutional rationale. So you cannot say, okay, this is decision taken by the European Council, then the members of the European Council are each accountable to the specific national parliament. It's impossible from a theoretical point of view. Unless you create an interparliamentary legislative chamber keeping under control the intergovernmental executive chamber. But it cannot be possible. So the idea the European Council can enjoy legitimacy, although that legitimacy is derivative, is an idea that has no ground at all in democratic theory. This is why we are facing a kind of Bonapartist, ancien regime executive power, without any check, because in that constitution the parliament has no role, any check on the decision of the European Council. If the European Council is internally divided according to relation of power and is not legitimate, that is a strange kind of state that we are moving on. There is also Roderick B. And Roderick B is, okay, we don't let the European Council to be the institution with the Council taking the decision. We bring all this policy theoretically to the supranational parliamentary circuit. But again, can we have a union of asymmetrical state? Malta, 400,000 inhabitants. Germany, 82 million inhabitants. And highly differentiated in terms of national identity. Can we have a union of this type synthesized in one single institution like the European Parliament? But the small state would disappear in the European Parliament. unless somebody can say, but they are not divided according to national line, but only according to partisan line. But that is not true empirically. Of course there is left and right, but left and right in Germany is not left and right in Greece. And in the very crucial issue, what matters is not left and right, but the geographical, political location of your country. There is a north-south divide, not a left-right divide. An east-west divide, not a left-right divide. So try to think that Europe should be a parliamentary nation-state at large is an expression of intellectual laziness. Europe is something different. It's not a nation-state at large. It's a union of states. And you have to combine asymmetry in demographic term and differentiation in national identity term. So, and then you have the possibility, which is more political ambiguity by necessity. Let's go towards the multi-speed Europe. Fine. If that is necessity, we can work on that. However, multi-speed Europe can become Europe a la carte, or can generate a Eurozone more and more organized according to Roderick A, according to an intergovernmental logic which centralized decision-making without democratizing that decision-making. So in the Eurozone, we have an example of the intergovernmental logic. They take decision without any control at all by the parliament. The parliament should be informed, informed. We are before 1789, be informed. We have only the role of parler, speak. Sure, okay. And the parliament should be informed, but who take control of that decision? And indeed, what we have is centralization without democratization. We transfer decision-making at the supranational level without democracy, and we spoil decision-making at the national level, destroying national democracy. That is the best solution, you think? I would like to ask to Wolfgang Schäuble and the non-paper he left a few days ago to the ECOFIN minister, to the Eurogroup minister. So, okay, how to come out from that? I have very few minutes, and that might be the most interesting part. and the part is that we have to change the paradigm. And in order to change the paradigm, we have to think to the European Union as a union, not as a state or an international organization. And in order to do that, we have to go back to comparative federalism, which is the only literature which deals with the question of putting together states. I talk about federal union, federal state. I have to skip this question, because here we have to make a clear distinction, a theoretical distinction, before then making a political distinction. Federalism is a genus to which different species belong. You have federation by disaggregation, and Germany is the utmost model of that, and you have federation by aggregation, and the US is the utmost model of that. And the two are federation, but the logic of those federations is completely different. In Germany, you have a strong center, tradition in the US and Switzerland, the only two successful cases of federation by aggregation. You have a very weak center. What you have in Germany is fusion of power, both at the horizontal, the Bundestag and the Chancellor, and the vertical. And where you have in separation of power in Switzerland and US is a distinction between level, a distinction between institutions. So for the reason that I try to explain in one of my books, for something that we can imagine, the role of the German culture, also in political terms, because it represented the most important group within the European Parliament, in both the socialists and the Christian Democrats, the role of the German create an idea that the European Union should follow the German model, which is, I think, the cause of many of our problems. We have to change and move in the direction of a union, not a state. And here I have to go back to the debate that we had in Philadelphia, where James Madison raised this very important issue. Is it possible to have a sovereign union of sovereign state? Of course, it's an oxymoron. It might be a paradox, but that is the question that we have to create, is to create a situation in which we have a sovereign union, sovereign regarding specific limited policy. Brussels has too much power, in my view. We have to give back many of those competencies to the nation state. And then we have the state which are sovereign regarding other policy. We have to free ourselves from the idea that sovereignty is an undivided concept. It can be empirically divided. We can put together sovereignty at one level with different sovereignty at another level. So I use comparison just for understanding better, elaborate concept. And here we have to go in the direction of a normative perspective. If it's a science, the future of Europe should be discussed, that science with proper concept and method. And my suggestion is there is no future for the European Union if we don't introduce fast a clear vertical separation. And in that sense, the European Council should be dealt as the very important problematic institution. Think what would have happened if Marine Le Pen, tomorrow Luigi Di Maio, and tomorrow Geert Wilders, and apart from Viktor Orban, Beatrice Dilo and others, would be there in the European Council. So the institution, the collective government of the European Union, which represent the idiosyncratic perspective of the single member state. It's like Laszlo said this morning, it's like to govern the US through 50 governors. It's like to have the racist governor of Alabama affecting the decision making at the federal level. This is something that we cannot say there is no time for opening a discussion. Through this muddling through, we enter in a nightmare. It is time to have idea, vision, theory, and then see what happened. But we cannot move on this empirical functionalist way of muddling through. With muddling through, we transform the Alabama governor in the president of the US, but this makes no sense. Then you need to have a separation at the horizontal level. And separation at the horizontal level means also that the parliament should be a checking and balancing institution of the executive, not be the center of the power. You need to separate it to balance, not to centralize, to concentrate, to fuse. We need to open up. And if I think we open up, we can in some way reassure those electorates that are fear to miss national democracy. They have legitimate fear. National democracy cannot be abolished. We cannot have a super state and we transform the member state of the European Union in a sort of Canadian province or German land. This is wrong. We need to protect national democracy and to create a supranational democracy on limited field, enumerated item, and if it's possible, fully democratized. Thanks. So this is the book where I try to make all these questions a little bit clear.
Yeah, it's presenting a book in 40 minutes. Wonderful job. I open up immediately for questions. Ljubljana stands.
Thank you very much, Professor FABBRINI, for this fascinating talk. I've long been a fan of the European Union as a union. I also wrote a PhD about that, also growing in
Can you say your first name?
Matej Aubel.
Matej.
So I think the concept of the union as a, I think it's descriptively correct, it's explanatory persuasive, and it's normatively advantageous for the functioning of the European Union. But what so whenever I'm presenting when I'm giving a similar talk, I'm usually thrown at a number of questions that are actually mocking the very idea, and I've had difficulties answering them, so now I pose these questions to you.
Don't trust me too much.
So usually the first mocking argument is that coming up now with the idea of a federal union, which is neither a federal state nor a confederacy, we have brought in through the back door again the idea of sui genericness. So it's again a sui generis concept, right? So that's the first objection that's usually thrown at this kind of argument. And then the other, which are maybe even more difficult and harder, are, so it's a question of what makes this kind of a European Union as a union viable in the first place. Because you have drawn on a number of historical examples where the entities have actually existed as unions, like the American Compound Republic before the Civil War. We had the German Bund, the Deutsche Bund. But as we all know from the history of federalism, all these unions, compound republics, eventually ended up as states. So how do we prevent the same kind of process taking place in the European Union? And thirdly, when you're creating this kind of a constitutionally pluralist structure, you preserve the sovereignty of the member states and you create sort of a functional sovereignty of the supranational level, then the challenge, of course, is how to divide. And you have called for sort of a strict division to introduce transparency to protect the national democratic processes. But how to respond to the actual objective challenges out there, economic challenges, security challenges, defense challenges, that appear to be drawing all the competencies from the member states to the supranational level, because the member states as sovereign entities have turned out to be unable to respond to these particular challenges. Thank you very much.
Next. Please.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Dimitris Papadimitriou from the University of Manchester. I'm not going to ask a very deep conceptual question here, but I wonder which kind of competences do you think that can be easily repatriated? And secondly, how do you envisage greater European Parliament control over the executive at the European level?
Who else? Please, Dora.
Thank you so much for this very interesting lecture. I just would like to ask something about the state. You said that the intellectual or theoretically, for thinking about the European Union, or the beginning of thinking is the state, and you end up with the state. So I was wondering that there's quite a bit of literature about how the state itself is transforming, and one of these, one of the theories is really Majorna, the regulatory state, which points to the disperse of power to independent regulatory agencies within the state, out of the center of government. And this, for me, working in the field of finance in European studies, is very relevant, looking at the European Central Bank, who is kind of the winner of the crisis, in a sense that the power of the European Central Bank has increased enormously, and the task that the European Central Bank is now conducting. So I was wondering, where would you locate in your proposed thinking about the federal European Union, these independent agencies of Europe, which seems to be just increasing their power?
I answer, because otherwise I cannot...
Okay.
We can make a second round. Is okay with you?
Yeah.
No, you are the boss.
No,
you have to decide.
Lazzi is the boss.
The problem is the time that we have.
Go ahead, please.
In the end, you will get at least 1.5 minutes. Oh, sorry. No, 5 minutes. One more question. No, I also have a question.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, great. Two more questions.
It's 20 minutes, not?
So
20 minutes left.
I joined the question raised here about competences. I understand that you think that the European Union as such should be again politicized, especially regarding economic policies and these areas. Parliament might mean that we have debates about EMU regulations and so on. That might be okay, but there are another side of the story whether we will have in your theoretical proposal common principles, values regarding liberal democracy, which is an issue here. Should we go those competencies back to the nation state, which might be very good for Orban and others whom you mentioned?
One more? Okay, just briefly. I'm a novice in comparative federalism, but do I know correctly that competencies and distribution of competencies is never written in stone? Of course, there should be guarantees, but really the point, I think, of Madison, who I think was that you have to institutionalize a strong representation both of the constituting peoples and also of the people of the US or United States, and then leave it to the friction between the two representations, how to balance these competencies, how to change them. So they don't stay fixed, but there is a continuous basically institutionalization of struggles between the two levels, how to distribute this kind of competencies.
I have
You have
1 hour roughly?
1 hour, 1.5, 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Sorry.
No, okay, this is a very good question, and thanks very much for submitting them to me. I start from here. Federal Union is not a sui generis, so it's part of the comparative federalism literature. And it is clear that the American experience till the 1930s fit this model, and of course the Swiss case is another example of that. There are the two empirical examples that I use discussed in this book at length, and in particular in my Compound Democracy, I try to set up the model coming up from the US. What is crucial here is the idea of the Federal Union is the Federal Union go beyond federation versus confederation, because the Federal Union is a federation with confederal feature. Why confederal feature? Because those confederal features guarantee the states constituting the Federal Union. Maximum example of that is the American Senate. Yeah, there you have 2 senators for state, regardless of the demographic size of the state. So 2 senators for Vermont, roughly like Malta, 2 senators for California, roughly like Spain before Catalonia going away. Okay, so moreover, within the Senate there is a rules called filibustering that for crucial decisions you should have the majority of 60 senators out of the 100 senators. Now, if you consider the 20 smallest states of the US, which of course have 40 senators, they have a population which is inferior than the 40 million plus of California. So this is an example of confederal arrangement. So California is the largest state, but has not the power to impose its view. So this is an example in which Madison was against this solution. Madison said we have to move in the direction of a federal union because we have to keep into consideration the confederal need of the state. How to make the union, let's say, sustainable as a union, not to transform the state? I work a lot, if you look, not only Compound Democracy, but because I needed to answer this question to myself as well, in American and Its Critics, a book that I published a few years ago. I insist to think that the US is not a state. The US is a Westphalian state in international relations, but is not a state in domestic policy. Still now, the example the US is not a state is the fact that you have the most crazy president unable so far to introduce important decisions because of separation of power, because of checks and balances, because of judiciary, House, Senate, and so forth. So the answer is, it was the war. War creates state, state makes war. It was the war which pushed the US externally towards the Westphalian logic. Do we want to go in that direction, or we decide to do what the Swiss did, that in order to keep the compoundness of that federal union, they give up to have an international role? I don't have the answer is a political answer. So Europe can decide in the federal union to move in the direction of Switzerland, or if you want to play a significant role internationally, you have to be careful that any significant role internationally can increase centralization within the polity. The competencies, the question of the competencies. So this is also Dimitris. Let me reverse the answer. Schäuble and I guess other people in Ministry of Finance in Germany want to introduce a Minister of Finance that is elected by the Eurogroup with the power to control the budgetary policy of the member state. Okay? So this is what I call Roderick A. Is centralization without democratization. Is it possible to let one minister of the 19 countries of the Eurozone to decide the budgetary policy of the member state of the Eurozone? This is an attempt to make democracy exploding. Okay? For somebody coming from Germany, this is a little bit frightening. What one have to think about the history of that country, and in order to, instead of to strengthen democracy, you weaken democracy. Now, I would reverse the logic. We need to have a European Minister of Finance dealing with a European finance, not with national finance. So that means to have a Eurozone budget, derived from Euro or European Union Eurozone taxes, not national transfer. Eurozone taxes, and that minister should deal with that budget and has to make himself or herself accountable not to the national parliament but to the European Parliament. These are the two logic. One is centralization. We create a state out of the Eurozone, or we separate. So I would say go in the second direction. I would advise reasonable people to go in the second direction, to stop the transfer of money. It's impossible to have a union of equals if the budget is derived from national transfer. Because anytime you touch that budget, there will be somebody in the north saying they use my money, my work. And there is somebody in the south that use that for humiliating us. We have to create a taxing regime which is independent from the taxing regime at the national level. Small budget. Already in the 1970s, they were talking, a very prominent commission of the European Union, European Economic Community, was talking about 3-4%. The budget in the US was traditionally under 5-7%. He had this peak during the Civil War, it went down again, and increased only during the wars to become 25% after the Second World War. So we need to have a very small budget, but that budget should be decided by democratically elected institutions on the basis of mandate coming from the voters at the European level. You can make Greece failing, at the same time you use the budget, if that is the will of the voters, in order to make investment in Greece, as they did in California, setting up new facility, military facility, technological facility, and so forth. So we have to change the logic. And if we don't change the logic, in my view, we enter step by step in decentralization. Here, again to Dimitris, if you look in the book, but also in other work I did, I went to look which kind of competences federal union, not federal state, federal union historically got. So then it's true what said Laszlo. They are not fixed, there are expansion. But if you look, US and Switzerland, they have three basic areas in which since the very beginning they were allowed to intervene as a federal authority. First, security. Security should be supranationalized. That means to have a defense, a common defense, common protection of the border, common intelligence, and so forth, security. So if I have to advise, we have to move in that direction. Second, the management of economy and the currency. So in that direction, the dollar creates the US exactly as the euro in some way might help to create Europe. And the third, development. It was the federal authority that invested in infrastructure, railway station, and now technological center, and so forth. Of course, then you have the complexity of urbanization, modernization that create the American policy states, even in Switzerland. But those are the basic elements that should be shared at the federal level. All the rest, theoretically, should remain at the national level. Because if I don't have a budget to fight about in Italy or in France or in Hungary, why I go to vote? Which is the stuff? What is the beef of national election if I don't control the budget? Now, with the European semester, before the Parliament discussed the budget, the proposal of the budget, the draft, budgetary draft should be approved by the Commission. Okay. Somebody is happy with that? You see dialogue? I don't see dialogue. I see that the national democracy are going to be reduced and reduced and reduced. Now, because there is no politics at the European level, there is only one framework. The mainstream parties at the national level should converge towards that mainstream framework. I don't care how to call it, Ordo Libera, what else? And obviously, you have grand coalition government at the national level, and who is the opposition to grand coalition government? Populist, nationalist, anti-European. So the growth of populist, anti-European, nationalistic movement come out also from the fact that there is no longer left versus right competition at the national level. And the competition is more and more and more between pro-European and anti-European. But this is very dangerous. Because if you institutionalize an anti-European coalition at the national level before or after Marine Le Pen will win, and what do? You don't have firewall between Paris and Brussels. So, Dora, the regulatory agency, of course, are very crucial in a union. Indeed, regulation, as Gian Domenico recognized, has been invented in the US. Because separation of power keep the political process very open, is an open end, and might politicize, can create stalemate, then important issue can be left to regulatory independent agency. And in this sense, we need to have a European Central Bank operating like the Federal Reserve, not playing the card of the last resort lender, let's say, by stealth. It should be part of the European Central Bank mandate. So I don't know if I answered to your question as well, but
no, you don't answer because
okay.
You answered.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. It was really very informative. We immediately continue go on, and I would like to ask the panelists to come here. And who chairs this panel? Sorry, come.